Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 9th event of the speaker series, Social Policy Unpacked, Exploring Pathways for Green and Digital Transitions. It's a series co-organized by DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion and the ZOE Institute for Future-fit Economies. And it's funded under the Horizon Europe program. My name is Christoph Gran. I'm the co-founder of the ZOE Institute. It's a think tank that works at the interface of policy, science, and societal organizations, and we are specialized on co-creation and new economic thinking. Before we come to today's speakers, Professor Milena Buchs, let me quickly introduce the series. We want to invite you, the wider public, policymakers, to think outside the box. Get yourself inspired with new ideas to ensure that the Green Deal, that the transition towards living within planetary boundaries is going to be successful and fair. We have 12 online seminars running. We started in December 22, and we have the last ones coming up until June 23. And don't miss the next session on June 15 with Tina Forsett from Oxford University on energy policy in crisis and transition. You can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and also on our homepage. We will advertise the upcoming events, and of course, we always share after the event some of the information, the recordings, the slides, etc. And today we will have a presentation of about 30 minutes, followed by Q&A, which will be hosted with together with Nadia from Unit F3 at DG Employment. During the intervention, we will collect some questions. You can use the QR code in the slides, or if that doesn't work, just put them in the chat, the questions. But ideally, you put them on Slido, so you can also comment on them, and we can see which questions are most wanted. But let's go to today's event. Last week, when opening the Beyond Growth conference in the European Parliament, President von der Leyen talked about a prosperous life, about economic growth not being an end in itself. And still, growth has been a guiding star for many policy and decision makers. But what comes next? How can we ensure that the elements of a good and prosperous life is still, or is the guiding star in a world that is developing beyond growth? How can we sustainably foster opportunities and resources for all? What is this vision of a good life, of sustainable welfare? What does it look like? And what's the role of equality in walking towards this vision? And how can policy support such a development? These are some very crucial questions that the research on sustainable welfare is working to answer. And the better, and I'm very happy to invite or to have the first professor of sustainable welfare from the University of Leeds with us today. Milena Buchs is going to speak, and her research seeks to contribute to making carbon reductions more equitable and well-being enhancing, while also being very effective in environmental terms. She's a co-investigator in the Horizon Europe project ToBe towards a sustainable well-being economy, especially in working package 3, which examines well-being economy case studies in the global north, but also the global south. Milena, I feel honored and I'm very happy to have you here. Please, the stage is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christoph, for the invitation and for organizing this excellent seminar series. I was here last week and saw the energy that it created. And good afternoon, everyone who has joined. Thank you very much for joining us. I will share my slides, see whether that works. Okay, so yes, as Christoph has said, I want to talk to you about sustainable welfare, and especially the role of equality and equity for achieving sustainable welfare. So we'll briefly explain what sustainable welfare is, how we define it, and then talk more about how equality can support sustainable welfare. I think an important dimension of that is actually how equality can support public acceptance of the green transition. So a whole section of my talk today will address that question. And then I will end by giving some policy examples for how we can achieve greater equality and sustainable welfare. So starting then with the vision of sustainable welfare, and that vision is really very much shaped by this idea of the safe and just space for humanity. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Kate Raworth's donut, which has the planetary boundary sort of on the outside, informed by Rockström and Steffen's research, for example, about the planetary boundaries. I also went to the Beyond Growth conference last week in Brussels, and Rockström actually presented his last findings, according to which already 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries are transgressed. So it really looks quite dire when it comes to the state we're in when it comes to ecological crisis. And then in the middle of the donut, of course, we have human needs, and we need to make sure that everyone's human needs are fulfilled now and in the future. So future generations' rights to have their human needs fulfilled is very important here as well. And where the concept of human needs really is taken from work by Doyle and Goff, Max Neef and others, which see needs as something universal at an abstract level, so at the level of rights, for example, while the need satisfiers can be context specific and need, deliberative processes to be defined and so on. Sustainable welfare also acknowledges the current lack of evidence of absolute decoupling of GDP growth and emissions and material use at the global level and at the speed that we need this decoupling to happen for us as humanity, basically, to meet climate targets and other ecological targets. So in that sense, sustainable welfare is embedded in the post-growth discussion. So I myself and others like Max Koch have defined sustainable welfare then as social policies that support the satisfaction of human needs within planetary boundaries and without economic growth. In a paper in which I discuss the suitability of universal basic income and universal basic services from a sustainable welfare perspective, I've defined 4 criteria for sustainable welfare, which are planetary boundaries and need satisfaction, which come from the donut, but then also fair distribution of opportunities and resources, as well as governance, democratic governance. So these are important dimensions, I think, that we can use to evaluate eco-social policies, sustainable welfare policies, to see whether they fit with this vision of sustainable welfare. So what would that mean in more concrete terms? I think implementing sustainable welfare would really mean that we need to prioritize social and environmental goals at various levels of policy. So the first is obviously measuring performance. I quite like this idea here of let's measure what we value instead of value what we measure. So at the moment, we seem to value what we measure. We value GDP. It is such a dominant measure of performance, but is it really what we should value as a society? Simon Kuznets, who is often cited as the inventor of GDP, has warned himself that GDP is not a suitable measure actually of social progress. So alternative measures really should be used. I think the challenge is to pick an alternative measure that could potentially even replace GDP or at least to complement GDP. So I've just recently read the book by Hoekstra, which is called Replacing GDP by 2030. And I was actually quite surprised myself to read that. He estimates that there are roughly 1,000 alternative measures of performance readily available already, which have been put forward by various organizations. And so the challenge is not inventing an alternative measure, the challenge is implementing one, or collectively agreeing which one should be the one that is the main competitor to GDP. So I'd love to discuss obviously more with you, especially if you're working on beyond GDP indicators, you know, about these sorts of challenges and how we could address them. And then prioritizing social and environmental goals also means prioritizing them within policy making. So it's not just about measuring what we do, but also directly have them shape social and environmental policy making and any type of policy making. So some governments, like the wellbeing-enhancing governments, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, and Wales currently, perhaps with a question mark behind Finland at the moment, because we have seen a change in government, have gone and actually agreed to try and prioritize social and environmental goals in policy making. The jury is still out, I think, about the extent to which they're successful in doing that. We have currently a paper sort of nearly accepted, conditional on some editorial changes, which looked at how well-being economy governments talk about GDP, talk about prioritizing social and environmental goals. And perhaps not surprisingly, they are less, you know, radical, let's say, than, let's say, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance or other organizations that promote this kind of approach. However, we have seen some positive examples. So, for example, Wales has just decided to stop all new road building. So any road building that would add more cars to the streets and would increase emissions is no longer allowed in Wales. And that goes back to being a well-being economy government. And then thirdly, social and environmental outcomes would also have to be prioritized within organizations and businesses. So rather than just having profit maximization as the guiding principle within businesses, for example, governments could incentivize businesses more to really think about, you know, how can they produce things, provide services that really satisfy people's needs instead of just creating new ones, and how they can conform to ecological objectives. So these are the sort of three main levels, I think, which we need to think about. Okay, so I want to talk to you now about how equality can support sustainable welfare. To summarize maybe the arguments here, I think that greater equality can address the growth dependency of welfare states, improve need satisfaction, and increase public support for the green transition. And I will go through these step by step. So first, we need to think about the growth dependency of welfare states. This is a very live debate within the sustainable welfare literature to say, okay, we have currently the challenge that welfare states are dependent on economic growth, and hence it seems difficult to decouple the two. So what can we do about this, especially if we are already in an environment where we have very low growth rates, and we may have to move to, we are likely to have to move to a post-growth context because of climate change. So the main two arguments about growth dependency are that we need growth to keep employment stable because of technological development, and also we need growth to be able to respond to the rising demand for pensions and healthcare and social care due to aging societies. So what can we do, and how can equality actually contribute to this? So for keeping employment stable, we can reduce working time and then redistribute working time more evenly. So this in itself, I think, is a matter of equality. And then secondly, greater equality can reduce what some authors have called failure demand, which is a type of demand, so welfare state spending, which arises from problems that are created by the current economic system and by inequality. So it is well documented in various research that inequality itself creates a whole host of different social problems. It creates health problems, physical and mental. it reduces educational attainment, it increases violence and crime rates, and so on. It reduces political trust and community cohesion. And so all of these problems create additional welfare demand. And so the idea is that if we have more equal society, we can reduce that type of failure demand. So that could free up resources for more spending on pensions and healthcare, and of course, other public services that satisfy people's needs. I also would like to talk a little bit about a new piece of research that we've just completed about equitable demand reduction, and how that could contribute to satisfying needs more directly and to meeting our climate targets. So we know that energy use and emissions are very unequally distributed in the EU. So based on the data set that we used, which was the EU Household Budget Survey data from 2015, combined with Exia-based data, which provides energy and emission data on a product level, it's an input-output database. We can use that data to estimate households' energy and carbon footprints. And on the right-hand side of the slides, you can see how energy use is distributed over income quintiles in the EU. In the top panel, you can see just how it is distributed in gigajoule terms. We see a clear gradient here over income quintiles. And the bottom panel shows the same thing. It's just expressed differently. It's expressed as a multiple of the fifth income quintile. So energy use as a multiple of the fifth income quintile's energy use. And here we can see more clearly sort of how unequally different types of consumption domains are distributed over income quintiles. And so transport always comes up as the most unequal. This is actually very consistent across different countries and different studies. And then followed by the inequality in total energy use from other consumption, and home energy use and food, and the energy related to food consumption are more evenly distributed across income quintiles. But nevertheless, we see in total, we see inequality in energy use and emissions. And so hence the question, would reducing these inequalities help with need satisfaction and achieving climate targets? And so what we've done in the paper is we asked, what are the emission saving from equitable energy demand reduction? And what we did there is basically through microsimulation, looked at the emission savings that we get from reducing the energy use of households in the top decile of energy consumption down to the 90th percentile of the energy consumption, or of the top quintile to the 80th percentile, or of everyone who has above mean energy use to the mean of energy use. We did that separately for each country and separately by consumption domain. So it's not for the whole of the EU, but for each country separately, because obviously we have quite different levels of energy use in different EU countries, and so on. And then at the same time, we were interested by how much do emissions increase if we increase the energy use of households who are in the bottom quintile of consumption and have poverty level income levels, if we increase their energy use to the 20th percentile. So, increase their energy use just a little bit. And the assumption here was that people who are in poverty and have low energy use are more likely to be households who are in fuel poverty. So basically saying that their low energy use is more likely to be involuntary rather than voluntary. Okay, I hope that made sense. I'm more than happy to answer questions on that later. So what we found is that we can achieve quite considerable emission reductions by doing that sort of combined approach of capping very high energy use while increasing low-level energy use of those in poverty. So, for example, within the home energy domain, we can achieve emission reductions of 11.1% if we reduce those in the top top quintile of the energy distribution down to the 80th percentile, and we can achieve 16.8% in emissions reductions for travel and 9.7% for total energy use. Of course, the savings are even greater if we reduce those who have above mean consumption to the mean, and you see the percentages here on the right-hand side of the slide. So another thing that I wanted to highlight is that when we compare the first and the second bar, this is the difference between just reducing households with very high energy use compared to doing that plus increasing energy use of those with low consumption and with poverty level incomes. So we can see that the difference between the two is not very big. It's we are talking about 2 to 3%, and that's quite consistent across different consumption domains. So basically, our conclusion in the paper is that we can afford, supporting those who are in fuel poverty, if we at the same time cap very high energy use. And so I want to come now to sort of talk about how could that support actually, or how could that contribute to increasing public support for the green transition, which is absolutely essential for us to move forward. We need very radical climate policies, but policymakers need the public support to be able to do that. So, the key question is sort of how does inequality in energy use, inequality in society more generally, how is that a barrier to actually achieving these radical climate policies and creating greater public support for them? So first, I want to show you the relationship between inequality and green behaviors in the EU, and then talk about public attitudes towards climate policies and equitable energy demand reduction. So this here is just one slide with some selective results from an analysis that I've done with my colleague Silke Schnepp, who is in the JRC, actually in the EU Commission, and Julia Bark, who supported us in this research. We used Eurobarometer survey data from 2022, which have pro-environmental behavior questions. And we checked, first of all, what is the gap between those who are on high incomes and low incomes. And there's a very, very clear gradient for all pro-environmental behaviors, as you probably can imagine, where those on higher incomes always engage more in these behaviors compared to those on low income. But we also checked how is participation in these behaviors linked to country level poverty levels and country level Gini coefficients, which is a very common measure of inequality, income inequality at the country level. And again, for all of these behaviors, we can see a clear gradient, which is statistically significantly correlated, where the percentage of the population where the percentage of the population who is participating in these behaviors is always higher in countries with lower levels of poverty and lower levels of inequality. So, for example, we see quite a steep gradient for using low consumption cars. Interestingly, also for alternatives to cars, which I found a bit surprising because other research shows that bus use, for example, is more common among people on lower incomes. But of course, the opposite is true for things like trains. And so maybe the two sort of balance each other out here. So we still see that gradient for people to use alternatives to a car when it comes to the relationship to poverty levels and inequality levels. Interestingly, so first we thought, okay, yes, in some ways that makes sense. Buying a low consumption car could be more expensive maybe than a more conventional car, and so cost is a factor. But interestingly, we see the same gradient for behaviors where you don't need a lot of money. So, for example, separating out waste or using less disposable items, we still see that same gradient. We did some country level regression analysis as well, using the same Eurobarometer data from, I think, 7 waves. And so we have, a sample of 133 observations in there, and can do some regression analysis. And basically poverty or Gini coefficient remains to be significant at the country level, even if we control for things like GDP, things like the proportion of renewable energy in the energy portfolio of a country, and so on, and CO2 emissions as well. So yeah, so this suggests, I think, that reducing poverty, reducing inequality could contribute to getting more people on board with pro-environmental behaviors. And similar results exist for attitudes towards climate policies. And here, the example that we use here is fuel taxes in the EU. So this analysis is based on the European Social Survey 2016, again with my colleagues Silke Schnepp and Elena Bastianelli, who helped us with this analysis, where we see high levels of opposition against fuel taxes in the EU. I should say it's 23 European countries, so EU is just a shorthand for that. We see quite high levels, however, or higher levels in regions that tend to be poorer than some other regions. So, for example, in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, the average among these countries is 46% of opposition against fuel taxes. What we find at the individual level is that low income and other characteristics of social disadvantage, among which we include fuel poverty, vulnerability, low education, low occupation status, and job insecurity, they're all significantly related to opposition to fuel taxes, even when we control for climate attitudes and political trust. So on this graph here, you can see that opposition against fuel taxes is higher for those who are not worried about climate change. So that makes sense. But also we see, especially among those who are worried about climate change, or who are at least somewhat worried about climate change, we see clear differences between those on low incomes who have more opposition against fuel taxes compared to those on higher incomes. Okay, and so finally on this slide, in this section, I wanted to go through some recent findings of Eurobarometer data. So thank you to everyone in the audience who has helped to create these surveys. I think they are very, very valuable surveys, and you will obviously know some of these results already, or most of them already, if you have been involved. But the figures here are really quite staggering, I think, when it comes to asking people about their attitudes towards equality and towards a fair green transition. So 81% of the EU population think that income inequalities are currently too large, and 78% think that governments should do more to redistribute. Also, 88% of EU citizens agree that the green transition should not leave anyone behind. So in other words, there's a lot of support for making climate policies fairer, and really for creating more equality, I suppose, when it comes to energy use. And this is confirmed by the next point, which says that 87% of the population think that the wealthy in particular should make more of an effort to reduce their energy use. So again, I think that really supports this idea of equitable energy demand reduction. The question is, how can we go about doing this? And I come back to that in a moment. We see other, quite high levels of support for sort of just climate policies, where, for example, revenues from carbon taxes are redistributed to the population, and even support for energy quotas, which could be seen as more restrictive, are actually still relatively high, with 62%. And 89% are in favor of governments investing more into public transport, which is a key infrastructure, of course, for achieving a fair green transition. In the project that I mentioned previously, so the Equitable Energy Demand Project, which was funded by the Center for Research on Energy Demand Reduction, CREDS, part of that project involved conducting deliberative workshops with a set of participants in England. We purposefully selected participants from different walks of life. So we had people there who had low energy use for car travel and for home energy use, and those with quite high levels of energy use. And we also had mixed groups to really see, you know, what sort of responses do we get when we ask people about their opinions for equitable energy demand reduction options. We found that some concerns were raised that could be expected. So, for example, concerns about limiting freedom. But there was also a lot of support for equitable energy demand reduction, where people say things like, yes, we need governments to actually put policies in place because voluntarily no one will actually act and reduce energy use. And there was particular support for restricting luxury energy use, so things like flights or having very, you know, a large number of cars, for example, or a very high home energy use. So we think, based on the data that we get, that the support that people express really comes from this idea that if everyone is on a more equal footing, then you know, energy reduction in total becomes more acceptable, because if individuals see that others use extra ordinary amounts of energy, that sort of raises the question, well, why should I make an effort to reduce my own energy use? So in other words, sort of more equality in energy use itself could actually create more support for the green transition. And then finally, I want to talk briefly about some policy options that we can use to increase equality in society, but also support sustainable welfare, so eco-social policies. So wealth taxation, I think, are an interesting idea which is much discussed in this field at the moment. So wealth taxes, some say, can help to fund sustainable welfare, and also, of course, they can increase equality. So one reason why wealth taxes are discussed in this literature is that assets are stocks, not flows. And so for that reason, wealth taxes can be a more stable source of funding compared to flows that are, you know, come from income, consumption, and even emissions, actually. While progressive wealth and income taxes are important for redistribution, it is also interesting to think about pre-distribution. So basically thinking about how can we make society more equal before we even start redistributing. And so more equal pay within and across sectors is really important here. And so just transition policies where, you know, unions are involved, for example, could be really important for this. But also governments can support alternative business models. For example, community-owned agriculture, housing and worker cooperatives, and so on. So Wilkinson and Pickett, for example, in the last chapter of their book, The Inner Level, discuss these sorts of options in a bit more detail in terms of how employee ownership can increase not only worker satisfaction and cohesion, community cohesion, but can actually improve company performance. And the hope is that it can also, of course, improve the ecological performance of these companies. But itself very important for distributing the assets related to owning a business in the first place. Like I said, I discussed the role of universal basic income and universal basic services in another paper from a sustainable welfare perspective. I will only very briefly summarize this here. I gave a whole seminar on this a couple of weeks ago, so there's lots more to say. But basically in the paper, I say that both of these approaches align with these 4 criteria of sustainable welfare: need satisfaction, redistribution, ecological objectives and support for democracy. Each of them does it in slightly different ways, but you know, both have potential really to fulfill these criteria. Another argument that I put forward in this paper is that these two policies are actually compatible, contrary to some other arguments in the literature which say they are incompatible, partly because of their sort of ideological foundations. And I can't quite see that. I think the two address slightly different types of needs. So we will always need some form of cash, for example, for needs where personal preferences and differentiated needs are quite important. So universal basic income can be important for that, while universal basic services, if we expand this to sectors like water, energy, and transport, they're good in these areas because the products or services that we provide in these areas are much more standardized. Okay, and so what I don't deny is that there will always be a financial tension between them. So yes, we do need to decide, you know, how do we allocate resources to each of these different policies, but I do think this can be overcome through democratic decision making. And then finally, I want to mention the work that we've done on fair climate policies, which links to the bit that I talked about the opposition against fuel taxes, which has a lot to do with the distributional impacts, I think, of such taxes. Here in the top right corner of the slide, we can see the tax burden from a carbon tax, a £50 per ton carbon tax on different in different consumption domains. And the tax burden here is expressed as a multiple of the fifth income quintile's tax burden, where we can see that especially taxes on home energy are particularly regressively distributed, burdening those in the lowest income quintile the most. Carbon taxes on total emissions are still quite regressive and somewhere in between home energy and transport, while transport is sort of the most evenly distributed one. The only one where we found a progressive distribution is a tax on flights, on which we've actually published a whole separate paper, which is only based on UK data, whereas this one here is based on EU data. But because flights are so unequally distributed in society, this actually comes out as a progressive tax. And in that paper, we argue that flight taxes can hence be justified more easily from a social justice perspective. So in that paper, we discuss measures like using the revenue from carbon taxes to pay an equal per capita cash handout to people, or to give people vouchers of the same amount for things like renewable electricity or public transport. We find that both of these measures are equally redistributive if you compare them like for like, so basically allocating the same amount to both of these measures. And green vouchers or provisioning also have a great potential to reduce fuel and transport poverty, as we find through the microsimulation modeling in that paper. And of course, if governments invest additional resources into expanding renewable electricity infrastructures and public transport infrastructures and shift people from cars into public transport, then we also see greater emission reductions with this voucher and provisioning approach. Okay, I conclude then by saying that reducing inequalities in income, wealth, energy use and emissions is a very important prerequisite, I think, to moving towards sustainable welfare. So greater equality can generate resources for sustainable welfare funding, especially by reducing failure demand, which can also make welfare states more growth resilient. Greater equality can also support a more even adoption of green behaviors in the population and generate greater public support for the green transition. Okay, I leave it here and thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Thanks a lot. And we will share the slides afterwards. So there are quite some references in here. And yeah, I hope everybody can read a bit more on this very interesting topic. Yeah, regarding the questions, Nadia, you want to give it a try, or we can't hear you? Not yet. Okay. Okay, maybe I can start with the questions while you rearrange your microphone. Okay, maybe before we go, there's a lot of questions on redistributing income. Maybe for the non-economists amongst us, maybe you can quickly repeat the quintile argument. Like, I'm not sure if everybody knows about which one is the first quintile, which one is the fifth quintile, and just, yeah,
absolutely.
Just maybe add this information to your slides. It would be very helpful, I guess.
Yeah, okay. And I was a little bit concerned about this. I wasn't quite sure, how much to explain this or not, because I didn't want to bore people with the details, but it's absolutely a very valid question. So what is done in distribution research is really to what you can do is basically create a distribution of any resource. Let's say we do it for income, where we line households up, starting with the one with the lowest income and ending with the one with the highest income. And then we can evenly divide that distribution into groups. And so we can use quintiles, for example, for that. So we would divide the whole sample up into 5 even groups, and that creates these income quintiles. Or, as we've done in the paper, we've done it with energy. So we have actually in that one, when I say we reduce energy use of the top quintile of consumers, so this basically just lines households up by their energy use, starting with the lowest and ending with the highest. And then we look at the highest quintile in this distribution. And how can I say it? So yeah, if you divide the whole distribution up into 100 bits, then you have percentiles, right? And so we know which household sits, let's say, at the 80th percentile, so which is after 80% of the energy use. And so we can then go and basically calculate what would happen if we reduce energy use of households which are in the top energy use quintile down to the 80th percentile, which is right at the bottom of that quintile, if that makes sense.
Wonderful.
I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is a little bit like technical to explain. I absolutely appreciate that. And in the paper, we were actually asked to explain that as well. So yeah,
I think it's perfectly fine now. Everybody should be on the same level. And let's get started with the first question. It's about media and public support, because I mean, if I understand the question right, the lowest quintiles might, even if they profit from redistribution, how would the media come into this game? If I understand the question right, the media are owned by the higher deciles or quintiles, how would they, or they would not deliver this message? They would probably not argue in favor of redistribution. So how did you have any chance to look into the role of media and in regard to public support of such a redistribution?
It's a great question. Thank you very much. If I'm honest, no, we have not had the chance to do a media analysis on this. I absolutely agree, though, that the role of media is absolutely crucial in all of this, right? Because the media, in a way, actually mediates between governments and the population, and the issues that we have seen in recent years and decades, probably in terms of you know, the whole sort of post-truth discussion and what is regarded as fake news or not fake news and so on. I think the media obviously play a very, very big role in all of this. And so I think it will be a very important piece of research to look into how, how media outlets, how we could work with media outlets, I think, to, you know, shape discourses and also, I guess there's a question here about responsibility as well, because the media have a very, very important responsibility here for actually shaping public opinion, and they influence the outcomes of elections and so on. And so having, you know, high quality media reporting is absolutely crucial. I would probably say we would also need sort of more underlying sort of better, I guess, deliberative processes in the population to almost sort of educate populations better in terms of how we consume media and how do we interact with media. And so, so I think things like climate assemblies, where people from all walks of life actually come together and really debate these things in detail with input from experts, that has shown that actually people who have previously had different opinions can be convinced of, you know, other positions. So
okay, thanks a lot. Already very interesting. Nadia, I see your.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, perfect.
Over to you.
And I joined my colleagues' Zoom instead. Yeah, I mean, and Christoph is doing this moderation brilliantly, but I can also jump in with maybe one question. So I see here on the top of the Slido question is that someone would like to hear your opinion on the social policies related to European Green Deal. So I assume also distributional questions in regard to that. So also, of course, very interesting for us who are working exactly in that field.
Yeah. So what is the question? So in terms of how social policy can support the green transition, basically?
Do already, or like how much is it part of it already, or how much could it be more part of it?
Yes. Yeah, and I think these are two sort of questions, because I think there's still a lot to do for social policy to become more involved with the whole environmental question. Obviously, the discussion has very much started, and it's great to see that, you know, that DG Employment has the Just Transition department, and some other ministries at the country level now have, so employment or social security ministries have departments for climate policy or the just transition. So I think these questions are now being asked in terms of how can we ensure that we design climate policies that are socially just. And so a big area is, of course, employment. And so this is probably the busiest area where most work is being done at the moment in terms of how can we ensure that workers in high carbon sectors are offered alternatives, are supported in this transition. How can we ensure that their voices are being heard? What sort of, you know, procedures do we have for collaboration there? But I think a lot more can be done in sort of other areas of the welfare state. So things that I talked about in terms of social security, to really see in terms of how can we make social security less dependent on economic growth, is quite an important question. And I talked a little bit about that. And a big other area, I think, where we will probably need more work in the future is how can the welfare state support people who are affected by climate change as well, which I didn't talk so much about, but we will see these effects in the future, you know, that people's homes get flooded, people might be prevented from going to work because of climate impacts, because infrastructure is damaged or trains are cancelled or whatever. So, you know, these sorts of risks I think will increase and will predominantly affect people who are more vulnerable and in more insecure positions. So I think the welfare state will have to play a role there in terms of supporting people in this area as well.
Thanks a lot for this very comprehensive answer. And I mean, also we're very glad to see that you were actually sharing the results of the Eurobarometer on fairness perceptions, which is a study that DG Employment has, or like our unit has been quite has been working on and designing and commissioning. And so in that regard, I also saw a question. Wait, sorry, no, I missed it. Okay, so I think I saw a question before on the fairness aspects of the Eurobarometer. And this must have missed it, but I can go to the other question. There's also one on the universal basic services that you presented. Here the question is if there's any data on how important the universal basic service concept would be to vulnerable population in order for them to support the green transition and have a higher public acceptance for the green transition.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And in fact, the fairness perceptions of the green transition Eurobarometer, it will be a great resource for this. And coincidentally, I do have a PhD student who wants to work with this data to see how support for some policies that could be interpreted as universal basic services policy, so especially public investment into public transport infrastructure, how that varies by socio-demographic characteristics. So we haven't yet actually got the results, but hopefully next time round I can talk a bit more about this. Her name is Sophie Satchwell. So yeah, she is working with this data, and will hopefully be able to find present some interesting findings on this. I can only speculate at the moment in terms of how this plays out. My suspicion from other surveys that we have seen in this field is that people on lower incomes tend to be more supportive of more redistributive policies and more supportive of public services more generally. So I would expect that people who are actually more vulnerable are more supportive for these types of policies. But let's see what comes out of that analysis. We have looked at the European Values Study, and that is a paper that is already published. I should have probably mentioned it, with Lily Paulsen. And we looked there at people's attitudes to whether government should prioritize the environment or economic growth. So that was interesting in itself, where we see attitudes are the other way around. So higher income people are more supportive of governments prioritizing the environment over growth. But when it comes to redistributive policies, we see the opposite, right? So higher income people on who have higher education and higher occupational status are less supportive when it comes to redistributive policies. So in the paper we do argue, there is a gap therefore to bridge. So because we need to convince different people in the population of different things, if that makes sense. So we will, quite understandably opposition will come from people who are in privileged positions and who do not want to give up that privileged position. So how can we convince people that that is a good thing and actually in the long run good for them as well? That is a challenge, I'm not denying that.
And there's some interesting questions on following up on the Eurobarometer that states that people would argue for a similar share of consumption, if I understood it right, regarding resources or emissions or whatever. And do you have any findings on, and then I'm referring to the question in the chat, regarding how the redistribution is taking place? So we live in a world of so-called freedom, where everybody is free to consume as much as he or she wants. And now, if this redistribution is taking place with vouchers or like non-cash elements versus cash or something that is seemingly more close to freedom, did you have the opportunity to research on that and to find out differences in how the redistribution is being perceived by different income groups or more generally?
Yeah, again, unfortunately, that is still a work in progress. So we are looking at that question as well with the same PhD student. So she will look at that question on the energy ratios or quotas, I think it is called in that survey. Yes, which is that idea that everyone gets a similar amount or the same amount of energy allocated as a sort of basic allocation.
But that's communism.
Yeah, you would have thought that is quite an unpopular measure, but actually more than half of the EU population are actually in favor of such a measure. We were surprised as well. What we found in the qualitative data, because we did ask people about rationing as well, is that, and that might be a bit UK specific because rationing obviously played a role in the Second World War and actually worked quite well for distributing necessities in the population in a fair manner. But so in general, there's maybe more support. I don't know, actually, more support for that in the UK, possibly, than in some other contexts. The problem that is often raised is, but yes, what do you do with people who have higher needs, for example, due to disability or age or some other circumstances? And so that seems to be really something quite important to consider, to sort of say, yes, if we do something like that, it is important to have a mechanism where we can allow greater allocations for certain circumstances. You know, so that could be a needs assessment based approach, for example. But if that is taken into account, people say, yeah, that would actually be something that they are in favor of, because it would put people on an equal footing and therefore, yeah, create that support.
Okay. I'm actually also now seeing the question that I didn't find before on the Eurobarometer, also relating to that, what you just said, that so there's a lot of support for redistributive measures, but there are not many political parties that are actually taking these type of measures up, or it doesn't have a broad resonance at the political level. So the question is, what do you see is there such a contrast between the results of the Eurobarometer and the political realities?
Yeah.
That's a great last question.
Great last question, absolutely. And, you know, to me, it is not astonishing, I think, that we see that gap, unfortunately. And it relates a bit to the first question that we had. You know, we have to consider who are policymakers at the moment and who are their constituencies. And so I think, unfortunately, we have very strong lobby groups of powerful companies and interest groups that influence policymakers. And so policymakers are therefore quite cautious to put in place measures that disadvantage, you know, currently quite privileged people in society. So that would be my main explanation, actually, why we see that gap. And there's still, I guess, the perception that if one country introduces measures that regulate markets more to have more even distributions of income or wealth, that would put that country at a disadvantage if other countries don't do the same. So I think the European Union in particular has an opportunity here to act collectively at the EU level, for example, to say, okay, what can we do collectively to put such measures into place, or to at least encourage governments to put such measures into place, because then we would not have that sort of problem, that you put yourself at a disadvantage within just one country doing something like that.
Thanks for playing the ball back to the European level. And I mean, I'm sure we have quite some listeners from European policymakers, institutions, etc. So thanks a lot for sharing your insights with us. And it was
Thank you very much.
Pleasure having you. And I hope you will not be the last professor for sustainable welfare, and many others to follow. There's a lot of research to be done, and and there's already a lot of research out there. I think it's very astonishing how much you already did, you and your colleagues. And thanks for that. Thanks for being here, for answering the questions. Thanks to Frank-Simon Thomas and his team, and for this great initiative, and also to my team for supporting everything. And please register for the next event. Join us with Tina Fawcett on energy policies in crisis and transitions. And we will share more details coming soon. And wish you all a good day, and enjoy reading all these great papers that Milena shared with us, and see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.